A woman in a New York boarding house holds out a newborn baby, and the people who sold it to her take it back because its eyes are the wrong color. It will not pass as a Hamilton. Eva Hamilton needed a child who would, and she bought 4 of them until one did. She was not the only wife of her age running a life her husband could not see. In San Francisco, a society bride wrote a scandalous novel in secret and signed it with the name of a demon. In a Dutch castle, a baroness kept a past that would have closed every door in Europe. In Boston, a fortune teller opened a bank for women only, on money from a charity that did not exist. 4 wives, 4 second lives, every one of them paid for by a man who never knew. If you like your history with the drawing room door left open, subscribe. I go looking for the women the Gilded Age preferred to keep unexamined, and there is a new one here every few days. Chapter 1. The age gave a wife no self. A married woman of the Gilded Age could be the most watched person in a room and the least known person in the building. Everything about her was public. Her dress was reported. Her carriage was recognized on the avenue by people who had never spoken to her. Her calling list was a document that other women studied for meaning, and her box at the opera was a statement of rank that could be read from the floor by anyone who cared to look up. She was observed at breakfast by servants, at noon by shopkeepers, at 4 by the entire visiting apparatus of her class, and at 8 by a theatre. There has rarely been a category of human being in American life more continuously looked at, and there has rarely been one less examined. Because underneath the observation was a legal condition that most people have stopped being able to imagine. Under the common law the colonies inherited from England, a wife's legal personality was suspended for the duration of her marriage and absorbed into her husband's. The doctrine had a name, coverture, and a formulation so clean it sounds like a joke about itself. By marriage, husband and wife are one person in law, and that person is the husband. In practice, this meant that a married woman generally could not own property outright, could not make a contract, could not keep the wages of her own labor, and could not sue or be sued under a name of her own, because she did not have one. New York began dismantling this in 1848 and extended the work in 1860. Other states followed at their own speed across the second half of the century. These statutes are usually presented as the end of the old regime, and they were not. What they created was a legal capacity that social practice declined to honor for another 2 generations. A woman could own property on paper long before a bank, a broker, a family lawyer, or a husband would behave as though she could. The law said yes, and the teller said no, and the teller was the one standing between her and the money. That gap is the country these 4 women lived in. Take the ordinary daily texture of a marriage. A wife's money was not income. It was an allowance, a sum arrived at by negotiation with a man and revisable by him whenever he chose to revise it. Robert Ray Hamilton agreed to give his wife $6,000 a year for what the period called pin money before he agreed to marry her, and the quarrel that finally destroyed that marriage was a quarrel about lowering the figure. The allowance was not a courtesy. It was the mechanism. Take the name. A woman of this class was Mrs. followed by a man's name. That was not a description of her. It was an office she held, at another person's pleasure, and could be removed from, which is precisely why the office could be counterfeited, and precisely why counterfeiting it worked so well for so long. Take the work. A woman's professional earnings, in the rare cases where she had any, were contested territory inside her own house. A pen name for a writing wife was not modesty, and it was not shyness. It was a financial instrument. It kept the check. And consider last what identity actually was in 1880. There was no photograph on any document. There were no numbers assigned to persons. There was no central registry that could be telegraphed for a match. Identity was a performance backed by testimony, a name written in a hotel register, a letter of introduction from someone respectable, a signature on a deed, a statement made to a census taker who wrote down whatever he was told. A woman with sufficient nerve could be somebody else by dinner in the next city, and there was no apparatus in the United States capable of contradicting her. And consider one more thing, which is who benefited from a lie once it had been told. A family's respectability was an asset, jointly held and jointly insurable, and the discovery that a wife had been someone other than she claimed did not damage her alone. It damaged the name, the daughters, the marriages the daughters had not yet made, and the standing of every relative who had ever received her, which meant that the people best placed to expose one of these women almost always had the strongest possible reason not to. Silence was not weakness in that world. Silence was asset management. Now put the two halves together. A class of women under permanent observation, and an era in which being looked at and being known had almost nothing to do with each other. 4 of them worked out what that combination made possible. In San Francisco, a young wife living in her mother-in-law's house on an estate that is now an entire town wrote a novel in secret and published it under the name of a demon, and then sat in the drawing room while the city speculated about who the author might be. In the Netherlands, a saloonkeeper's daughter from a Michigan lumber town married a baron in his own castle, while a warrant for her arrest was still open in California, and wore his title for the next 45 years. In Boston, a fortune teller invented a charitable fund that did not exist, built a bank on top of it that would accept money only from unmarried women, took in about $500,000 from roughly 1,200 of them, and made silence a condition of membership. And in New York, a woman already married to one man married another, installed her real husband in the house as a relative, faked a pregnancy, and bought newborn infants off the street until one of them was pale enough to pass as the heir to one of the oldest names in America. None of them knew each other. None of them was copying anyone. They arrived separately at the same discovery, which is that a self nobody is looking for is a self nobody will find, and that the safest place in the world to build one is inside a marriage where the looking has already been done. There is one more thing they had in common, and it is the thing that makes this a Gilded Age story rather than a story about 4 criminals who happen to be women. In every single case, the money that built the second life came from the first, not stolen from a stranger, not earned somewhere else, taken, quietly and over years, out of the household budget of the marriage the second life was concealed from. Gertrude Atherton wrote on hours the Atherton estate was paying for. May Dugas worked out of an address and a title her husband supplied. Sarah Howe operated as a respectable Boston married woman, which was the only reason 1,200 strangers handed her their savings. Eva Hamilton built an entire counterfeit family on remittances of $500 to $1,500 sent by the man being counterfeited against. Every one of these women was funded by the institution she was betraying. That is not a coincidence, and it is not irony. It is the only place a wife of that era could possibly have got the capital. Each of them built her second life the same way in the end. Not with a disguise, with a document. A serial signed in a name that belonged to no living person. A register signed in a name she had chosen that morning. A passbook backed by a charity that existed only in her own mouth. A death certificate written for a baby in a name that was never anybody's. A name written in another hand. Every one of them was found out. Chapter 2. A girl with no house of her own. Her parents' marriage dissolved when she was 2 years old, and an aunt is reported to have refused to take her in because she was difficult. That is the whole of Gertrude Franklin Horn, and it is worth setting down before anything else, because everything she did afterward is a variation on the same problem. She was born in San Francisco on the 30th of October, 1857. Her father, Thomas Ludovich Horn, was a tobacco merchant out of Stonington, Connecticut. Her mother, also Gertrude, was from New Orleans. They separated in 1860. The girl was 2. What she got instead of a household was a grandfather. Stephen Franklin was a devout Presbyterian, a relative of Benjamin Franklin, and a man who held one opinion that would alter the course of American letters without his ever suspecting it. He insisted that the child be well read. So she read. She was sent to St. Mary's Hall at Benicia, and briefly to the Sayre School at Lexington in Kentucky, and an aunt is said to have declined to house her on the grounds of rebelliousness, which returned her to California, to the grandfather, and to the mother whose marriage had failed. There is no fortune anywhere in this account. The Horns and the Franklins were respectable San Francisco, connected and educated, and that is not the same thing as rich. And in the society she was being raised for, it was not remotely the same thing. The Franklin connection deserves one line of caution, because it is the kind of detail that families polish. A relative of Benjamin Franklin is a wide category, and what it meant in practice was not money or position, but a story the household told about itself, and a grandfather who took the story seriously enough to educate a granddaughter as though letters were the family business, which, as it turned out, they were about to become. She was, in other words, a girl with a famous surname on one side, a great deal of reading, no money, and no house that was securely hers. That last item is the one to keep hold of. Everything in her early life is provisional. She is at her grandfather's, then at a boarding school, then at another one in another state, then at an aunt's, then not at an aunt's, then back at her grandfather's. She was not neglected, and she was not poor in the way that word is usually meant. She was simply never anywhere permanently, and the difference between a child who is loved in one house and a child who is passed between 4 is not a difference in affection. It is a difference in what she believes about the ground she is standing on. Into the society of that city came a well-read, portionless girl who had already noticed that the adults around her did not keep their promises. Then George Atherton came to call. He came to call on her mother. This detail has been recorded so often and so blandly that it has lost the ability to shock, and it should not have. A young man of the Atherton family, heir to a Chile trade fortune, presented himself at a San Francisco house and paid court to a separated woman, and then transferred his attentions to her teenage daughter. He proposed. She refused. He proposed again. The record says she accepted his 6th proposal, which tells you something about him and rather more about her, because 5 refusals is not indecision. 5 refusals is a young woman who could see exactly what she was being offered and kept declining it until the alternative looked worse. On the 15th of February, 1876, they eloped. She was 18 years old. The house she married into was not a house. It was a system. Faxon Dean Atherton had made his money in the Chile trade and had bought an enormous tract on the San Francisco Peninsula, the estate called Fair Oaks, later Valparaiso Park, and if you want the scale of it in a single sentence, here it is. Her mother-in-law's garden is now a town. The land the Athertons held on the peninsula became the incorporated municipality of Atherton, California, and it remains one of the wealthiest addresses in the United States. The family did not live on a great estate. They lived on a future postcode. The authority in that house was Dominga de Goñi Atherton, Chilean-born, formidable, and entirely clear about what a young wife of the family was for. And the authority over Gertrude, in theory, was George. George is the empty room at the center of this story, and the script of her life makes no sense until he is properly understood. He had no profession. He had no business capacity. He had no independent standing of any kind. He lived on his family's money under his mother's roof and his mother's rules. And he had, from morning to night, nothing whatever to do. Neither, officially, did his wife. That is the symmetry the marriage was built on, and it held for exactly as long as it took her to notice the difference between them. They were both idle. Only one of them found it unbearable. She found the house stifling. She said so, later, at length, in print, when she was a famous woman and could say what she liked about people who were dead. At the time, she said nothing at all, because there was nobody to say it to. Her mother-in-law regarded a woman of the family doing anything publicly as an embarrassment waiting to happen. The days were structured entirely around calls, meals, and the management of servants, and she was expected to fill them and to be grateful. The days themselves are worth reconstructing, because the modern viewer imagines leisure as freedom, and it was nothing of the kind. A young married woman on such an estate rose to a schedule she had not set. Breakfast was at a fixed hour. The morning was for the household books and the ordering, both of which were in practice supervised by her mother-in-law. The afternoon belonged to the calling system, which was not socializing but administration. Cards left, cards returned. Visits paid at the correct interval to the correct people in the correct order. Every one of them recorded and reciprocated and remembered. The evening was dinner, and after dinner, the drawing room, and in the drawing room, conversation of a kind that had been agreed in advance to be suitable. There was no hour of that day that belonged to her, and there was no room in that house with a door she could close on the grounds that she was working, because she was not permitted to be working. What she had, instead of freedom, was surveillance without purpose. Servants who knew where she was at all times because it was their job to. A husband with nothing to do who was therefore always somewhere. A mother-in-law who ran the establishment and regarded the young Mrs. Atherton as an item within it. In 1882, her small son George died of a childhood illness. The sources disagree on which one, and the disagreement is not important. The fact is, she was 24 years old, she had lost a child, she was living in a house where her grief was a social event to be managed, and she had a daughter, Muriel, and an allowance, and a bedroom, and no legitimate way on earth to be a person. It was in that year that she sat down and wrote a novel. She did it in secret, reportedly in about 3 months, in a house full of people who would have stopped her. Chapter 3. She signs herself with a demon's name. In a house where a wife who worked was an obscenity, she wrote a novel in secret, reportedly in about 3 months, and sold it to the most read weekly in San Francisco. Understand what that sentence is actually describing, because the modern ear slides past it. She was not writing in a study. She had no study. She was writing in a household of servants, any one of whom might mention it, and of family, all of whom would have regarded it as a scandal, and she was doing it fast, which suggests she had been composing it in her head for a long while before her hand ever moved. Nobody writes a first novel at that speed, unless she has been writing it for years without paper. And then she sold it, which is the part that matters. The Argonaut was the most widely read weekly in San Francisco, edited by Frank Pixley, and it took the manuscript. Serialization began in March of 1882. It ran under a single name, and the name was not hers. She signed it Asmodeus. Asmodeus is not a decorative flourish, and it is not a piece of vague Gothic atmosphere borrowed by a bored young woman for effect. Asmodeus is a demon with a specific job. In the Book of Tobit, his office is the destruction of domestic happiness. He wrecks marriages. That is what he is for. So here is a wife of 24, living under her mother-in-law's roof, forbidden by every convention of her class from earning $1, publishing in secret, and choosing as her signature the name of the thing that destroys households. She was not hiding behind that name. She was announcing something inside it to an audience of one. And it was a joke nobody in the house could have been told. A young woman who had been educated on the insistence of a Presbyterian grandfather reached into scripture for the exact demon whose business was wrecking domestic peace, and signed a magazine serial with him in a city where her mother-in-law was at that moment deciding what was and was not becoming in a wife. There was nobody at that dinner table she could have explained it to. The novel was called The Randolphs of Redwood, and it carried the subtitle A Romance, and it was not one. Its plot was taken, barely disguised, from the collapse of a real San Francisco family, the Gordons of Mayfield Grange, who were neighbors, who were socially known, and who were recognizable on the page to every reader in the city whose opinion counted. It contained an alcoholic mother. It contained a sexual frankness that San Francisco was not prepared to receive from anybody at all, and was very much not prepared to receive from one of its own wives, though of course it did not yet know that it had, and she did not soften it. That is the thing about the Randolphs of Redwood that the modern reader, who cannot easily get hold of a copy, tends to underestimate. She could have written a safe romance. A safe romance would have sold, would have paid, and would have been entirely deniable if anyone had ever traced it to her. Instead, she took the private catastrophe of a family her own family knew, put it into a magazine that everybody those families read, and added to it a candor about drink and about sex that no respectable woman was supposed to possess, let alone print. The Argonaut published it because Frank Pixley knew exactly what he had. A weekly paper in a young city lives on being talked about, and a serial that half of San Francisco believes to be about people half of San Francisco has dined with is not a literary risk. It is circulation. So the paper had its sensation, and the author had her fee, and neither of them had a name to attach to it. The city went looking for the author. For weeks, it was the question. The serial, in the account left by Cora Older in her book San Francisco, Magic City, stupefied San Francisco and Menlo. People who had known the Gordons read it and recognized what they were reading. People who had not known the Gordons read it and wanted to know who had. Names were proposed and dismissed. The Argonaut said nothing, and in a drawing room on the peninsula, the woman who had written every word of it sat with her hands in her lap while the subject was raised and turned over and speculated about and put down again, and she poured the tea. That is the image to hold from this segment. Not a woman scribbling by candlelight. A woman listening politely to a room full of people trying to guess her name. She kept doing it. And this is the part that separates her from a simple story about a repressed wife with a diary, because there was money involved, and she kept the money. The Athertons paid for everything else. They paid for the house, the food, the servants, the horses, the standing. And above all, they paid for the leisure, which is the thing a novel actually costs. George had no profession. The entire establishment ran on the chilly trade fortune that Faxon Dean Atherton had assembled. Every hour Gertrude Atherton spent writing was an hour purchased for her by the family she was concealing the writing from. What she concealed was not only the authorship, it was the existence of an independent economic life inside a marriage that was designed to contain none. She was living in a house where a wife's money came as an allowance, revisable, from a man, and she had quietly opened a second channel that no one in the building knew about, running the other way. The pen name was not a veil, it was a bank account, and it is worth knowing that she was one of a great many. Women had been publishing under male and neutral names throughout the century, in England and in America. For exactly this combination of reasons: to be reviewed on the work rather than the sex of the writer, to be publishable at all in certain markets, and to keep the proceeds out of a household that would otherwise absorb them. What separates Atherton from the general run of that practice is what she did with the freedom. A pseudonym used defensively produces safe books. She used hers to publish the single most incendiary thing available to her, about people her family dined with, in the paper her family read. She did not take the disguise in order to be careful. She took it in order to stop being careful. Look at what the era had made her do to get it. To publish a book, an educated American woman of good family in 1882 had to become somebody else, and the somebody else she selected was a demon. There is no version of that arrangement in which the fault lies with her. She would use the trick twice more, and she would refine it each time. When her first full novel, What Dreams May Come, appeared in 1888, it was signed Frank Lynn, which is a man's name, and which is also her mother's family name broken in half. Asmodeus was a hiding place. Frank Lynn was a costume with better tailoring. The third name she published under was her own, and by then it was famous. 3 signatures, in sequence. A demon, then a man, then herself, each one bought with a book. And notice the direction of travel, because it is the opposite of every other woman in this film. Atherton's names get closer to the truth with each one. Asmodeus is a disguise that is also an accusation. Frank Lynn is a compromise, a masculine cover with her mother's family concealed inside it, respectable enough to carry a novel through a London publishing house. Gertrude Atherton is the real one, arrived at last, and by the time she used it, the market had been prepared for her by 2 people who did not exist. Every other second life in this story ran away from the woman who built it. Hers walked toward her. The household went on paying for the paper, the ink, the hours, the quiet, and the roof, in complete ignorance that it was funding the destruction of its own peace. But that is running ahead, because the first one had not yet been paid for. The Argonaut serial ran its course. The city eventually stopped guessing. And at some point in the aftermath, for reasons she never fully explained, and that were probably closer to defiance than confession, Gertrude Atherton told her husband's family that Asmodeus was her. Chapter 4. The barrel comes back from Chile. She told the family she was Asmodeus, and the family stopped speaking to her. There was no scene, as far as the record allows anyone to reconstruct. There was no confrontation of the kind a film would want. There was simply a closing, of the sort that a certain class of family performs extremely well, in which nothing is said and everything is understood. And a young woman discovers that the temperature of every room she enters has dropped by a measurable amount and will not be rising again. For Dominga de Gogni Atherton, publication by a woman of the family was an obscenity, not a disappointment, not an eccentricity, an obscenity, which is a word about decency rather than about quality, and the distinction matters. The objection was never that the novel was bad. It was that a woman of the Atherton family had made herself visible on her own account, in public, for money, without permission, and that this was a category of behavior for which the household had no procedure except exclusion. George resented the hours. He resented the money more. The marriage did not end. It continued, which is worse, as a facade maintained by 2 people who had run out of things to conceal from each other and had a great deal left to conceal from everybody else. She had a daughter to raise in it. She had no income of her own beyond what a weekly paper would pay for fiction, no legal capacity to speak of, and nowhere at all to go. It is worth being exact about what she had actually lost, because from the outside she had lost nothing at all. She still had the house, the servants, the standing, the carriage, the allowance, and the name. Nothing had been taken away from her. What had been taken away was the pretense that she belonged to these people. And once that was gone, she was living in a hotel run by relatives who disapproved of her. There was also, in that silence, a piece of information she must have found intolerable. They had all read it. Every person who now declined to discuss the matter with her had read The Randolphs of Redwood, or had listened to somebody describe it, and had been gripped by it, and had wondered aloud who wrote it. Their objection was never that the work was poor. It was that the work was hers. She had produced the most talked-about piece of writing in the state, and the reward for it was a house full of people who would not meet her eye. And then, in 1887, the problem solved itself in the most grotesque manner available. George Atherton went to sea. He was bound for Chile, the country his father's fortune had come out of, aboard the Rio de Janeiro, and somewhere on that voyage he died. What follows is the image this segment exists for, and it must be handled with the care the record demands, because it is the kind of story that gets better every time it is told, and the telling has been going on for a very long time. Her biographers tell it. She told it herself. The account is that the ship had no means of keeping a body, and that in order to bring him home at all, George Atherton was preserved in a cask of rum, and the cask was shipped to San Francisco and delivered to the house. Take that as it is offered, as the story her biographers tell, and that she told about herself, rather than as a document anybody has produced. It is reported rather than proven, and this film will not pretend otherwise. But consider it as she must have, a barrel standing in the hall of a peninsular mansion. Inside it, the man who had courted her mother, proposed 6 times, resented her work, and provided, without ever once intending to, the leisure in which she had destroyed a household on paper under the name of the demon whose office is destroying households. Her biographers record that she admitted in print, decades later, to having wished him dead. The wording of that admission has not been confirmed, and this film reports it as they do. And she was, at that moment, free in a way that a divorce could never have made her. A divorced woman of her class in 1887 was finished socially, dependent on a settlement, and permanently explaining herself. A widow was respectable, unsupervised, and in possession of her own decisions for the first time since she was 18. The law that had erased her while he lived handed her back to herself the moment he stopped. That is the mechanism these 4 women were all working against, seen from its other side. A wife had no self. A widow had one. The whole difference was a death, and none of them controlled it. There is no record of what she said when it arrived. There is no reason to think she said anything. But she had spent 5 years being told that a woman of the family did not make a spectacle of herself, and the family had just taken delivery of one. She did not stay long after that. In 1888, she left for New York, leaving Muriel behind with her grandmother. Then London, then Paris in 1889, at the invitation of her sister-in-law, Alejandra Rathbone. A London publisher, Routledge, took her first 2 books. She met Oscar Wilde through his mother, Jane Wilde, and recalled in her memoir having gone considerably out of her way to avoid the introduction. She met a very young Winston Churchill, who told her he liked her novels. She came back to California in 1890, after the deaths of her grandfather Franklin and of Dominga Atherton. Dominga, at the end, made a choice that says everything about the house Gertrude had escaped. She raised Muriel herself, and she settled on the granddaughter the inheritance that had been meant for George. The grandmother chose the granddaughter over the daughter-in-law, and the daughter-in-law went to Europe and became famous. The Paris and London years are the hinge of her whole life, and they are easy to skate past because they look like tourism. They were not. She was a widow of 30 with a daughter being raised by somebody else, no fortune of her own, and a body of work published under two names that were not hers. And she went to the two cities where the English language book trade was actually decided and set about being introduced to it. Routledge took her first two books because she was in London to make that happen. She had spent 11 years learning how to run a life nobody in her house could see. She now applied the identical skill in the open, on her own account, in an industry that did not care whose widow she was. And she did become famous, on a scale that is easy to underestimate now. The splendid, idle 40s in 1902. The Conqueror in the same year, a best-selling novel about Alexander Hamilton, of all the men in American history. Black Oxen in 1923. A gold medal from the International Academy of Letters and Sciences of Italy. The Legion of Honor in 1925. Election to the American Academy of Arts and Letters in 1938. A full-length memoir, Adventures of a Novelist, in 1932, in which she told the whole thing herself. She died in San Francisco on the 14th of June, 1948, at 90 years old, and she is buried at Cypress Lawn. The woman who had to become a demon in order to publish a novel died a decorated national figure under her own name. She is the only one of these four who got out, and it is worth being precise about why, because the reason is not luck and it is not virtue. Gertrude Atherton counterfeited less than any of the others. She did not manufacture a fortune, or a family, or an institution, or a child. She manufactured a signature, and what that signature was concealing was not a crime. It was a right to work. The second life ate the first, and it was an improvement. The three women who come next counterfeited more and kept less. The one who follows her did not hide a career behind a false name. She hid an entire past behind a title, and she married a man in his own castle to get it, while a warrant for her arrest was still open on the far side of the world. Chapter 5. A saloonkeeper's daughter studies in a brothel. She was living at the most famous house in Chicago, and she was enrolled in university courses in psychology, French, and business law. Hold those two facts next to each other, because almost everything about May Dugas is contained in the space between them. She was not a woman who fell into the life she led. She was a woman who selected it, moved into it, and then went out in the mornings to be trained for the work she intended to do with it. She was born in Chicago on the 23rd of May, 1869, to Eugene and Sophie Dugas, French-Canadian immigrants. There was an older brother, Paul, and a younger brother, also Eugene. By 1880, the family had moved to Muskegon, Michigan, where the father kept a saloon. He died somewhere between 1883 and 1885. The record does not pin the year, which is its own comment on the size of the family's importance to the people keeping records. May was somewhere around 14 or 15. The widow took her children north to Menominee, a Lake Michigan lumber town on the Wisconsin line, where the money came out of the pine and left again on the boats. Menominee in the 1880s was a town built entirely on one thing, and the thing was finite. The white pine of the upper Midwest was being cut at a rate that everybody involved understood could not last, and while it lasted, the money was extraordinary. There were lumber barons in that county with fortunes that would have been respectable in Chicago, and there were mill hands and rivermen and the families of both, and there was very little in between. It was a place where a girl could see wealth at close range every day of her life and understand with total clarity that there was no path from where she stood to where it sat. And in Menominee, the saloonkeeper's daughter went to high school and was remembered as a precocious student. That is the entire respectable record of May Dugas, a dead father, a lumber town, and a bright girl. It is worth stopping on the wound before the career begins, because every choice she made afterward reads differently once it is established, and because this is the only place in her long life where anybody in the world had power over her that she had not personally handed them. She was clever in a town that had no use for clever. She was poor in a household that had recently had a small business and now did not. There was no money for anything beyond the high school, and there was no route out of Menominee for a girl of her class that did not run through a marriage to a man in the timber trade. She was 18 when she stopped waiting for one. In 1887, she left for Chicago and took up residence at Carrie Watson's at 441 South Clark Street. Carrie Watson's was not a back room in a bad district. It was the most celebrated house in the city, a place with a reputation that reached other cities, the kind of establishment whose name a Chicago newspaperman could print without explanation and be understood. And while she lived there, she enrolled in university courses: psychology, French, business law. Consider the shape of that curriculum, because it is not the reading list of a woman drifting, it is a syllabus. Psychology, which is the study of what moves people. French, which in 1887 was the language of the class she meant to enter. And business law, which is the study of obligations, of what can be enforced, of what a signature does and what a release absolves. She was building a professional. The first operation came quickly, and it established the pattern she would run for 30 years. A wealthy young man proposed marriage. His father, alarmed, did what wealthy fathers did in that decade. He hired a Pinkerton, a detective named Edwards, to find out who this woman was. Edwards found out. And what May Dugas did with that discovery is the thing that separates her from every ordinary girl in every ordinary house in Chicago. She did not run. She did not deny it. She understood immediately that the father had just told her, by the act of investigating, exactly how much the engagement was worth to him, and she named the price. $20,000 for the details of the engagement not to be divulged. He paid. $20,000 in 1880s money to a girl not yet 20, out of a saloon family in a lumber town. Set it against the only comparable figure in this story. It was 3 times what Robert Ray Hamilton, one of the wealthiest young men in New York, would settle on a wife as her entire annual income. And she took it in a single conversation, out of nothing but a piece of information about herself. The lesson she took from it is the lesson she would apply across 3 continents. The most valuable commodity a woman in her position possessed was not her body, and it was not her beauty. It was other people's need for silence. And silence was a commodity with a peculiar property, which she seems to have grasped immediately, and which most blackmailers never do. It does not deplete. A stolen object can only be sold once. A secret can be sold every time the buyer's circumstances change, and the buyer will keep paying not because he is weak, but because the arithmetic never alters. Whatever she asks will always be less than the cost of the thing becoming known. She had found, at 19, a product with no manufacturing cost and no natural end, and she spent the rest of her life refining the distribution. There is one more thing in the Chicago years that deserves saying, because it complicates the picture in a way this film should not tidy up. Carrie Watson's was a business, and the women in it were being used. Whatever agency May Dugas exercised there, and she exercised a great deal, she exercised it inside an arrangement designed by other people for their own profit. She was not a criminal mastermind at 18. She was a poor girl in a brothel who had noticed, faster than most, exactly where the leverage in the room actually sat. And she had just met the man who would spend years trying to stop her. Detective Edwards did not go away after that first job. He turns up again in Tokyo, on the far side of the world, intervening a second time. There is something almost companionable about it. For a long stretch of her life, the only person who knew both of May Dugas's lives was the man being paid to expose her. She did not stay in Chicago. She went to Portland, Oregon, and worked out of Emma Wingard's house. And there she acquired the one thing the trade requires more than nerve, which is a partner. Fanny Liesel would be with her for the next several years and across the next several thousand miles. By about 1889, the two of them were in San Francisco. Dugas entered a liaison with a Guatemalan coffee dealer, which is a phrase that sounds like local color and is in fact the beginning of the end of her American career. In 1890, May Dugas and Fanny Lyle were arrested for larceny. It was not blackmail this time. It was theft, and it was clumsy, and it was the only serious operational failure of her life. It put her in a California jail with a charge she could not talk her way past, at 21 years old, with everything still in front of her. It is the only time in this story that she appears to have been in something she did not design, and the shape of it suggests why. Blackmail is slow, private, and conducted entirely on her terms. Theft is fast, physical, and depends on the victim behaving predictably in the moment. She was good at the first, and she was evidently not good at the second, and she never attempted the second again, so she escaped. The two of them got out of custody and got out of the country, and they are named as fugitives in the San Francisco Municipal Reports for 1892, which is the last official notice the United States would take of May Dugas for a quarter of a century. She had left America with a warrant behind her, a partner beside her, and no legal identity she could safely use anywhere. Most people in that position disappear into a small life in a distant city. She went to Asia and began charging aristocrats. Chapter 6. A fugitive marries into a Dutch castle. When she walked into the Netherlands to be married in November 1892, there was still a warrant out for her in San Francisco. The route she took to get there is worth following in order, because it is the itinerary of a woman testing a method in increasingly expensive rooms. First Shanghai, with Fanny Liesel, where the partnership ended and the two women separated for good. Then Hong Kong, alone, where she met a British mining executive and came away with $25,000. The mechanism was the one she had invented in Chicago at 18, and would never need to improve. She made herself the possessor of a fact a wealthy man could not afford to have circulate, and then she set a price on its continued privacy. Then Tokyo, and the Imperial Hotel, and a man named John Kilpatrick. This one has to be told plainly and then left alone. She entered into an affair with him. The Pinkerton man, Edwards, intervened, as he had before. Kilpatrick returned to New York, and a few months later, he killed himself. There is no evidence that she wanted that, and there is no version of this film in which she is responsible for a man's death. But it happened. It happened downstream of her, and a documentary that skipped it in order to keep her interesting would be lying. She was not a rogue in a comedy. She was running a business whose product was fear, and one of her clients could not carry it. Then London, in about 1890, where she engaged a companion named Belle Andrews, called Daisy, who would remain with her for years, and who is the only human being on record as having been inside both of May Dugas's lives at once, and having stayed. And in London, she met a Dutchman. Baron Rudolf de Pallant van Eerde was nobility of the old sort, with a castle to prove it, and he held a position that places him more precisely than any list of his properties could. He was Master of Hounds to the Princess of Wales. That is not a title you are given for money. It is a title you are given for being unquestionably the right kind of person. They were married on the 20th of November, 1892, at his estate in the Netherlands. She was 23 years old. She became the Baroness de Pallant van Eerde, with a residence at Castle Earder and a life in London, and she was, from that afternoon forward, a woman whose name opened any door in Europe. He knew none of it. Not Muskegon, not the saloon, not Carrie Watson's at 441 South Clark Street, not the $20,000 taken out of a frightened father in Chicago, not Portland, not Emma Wingard's, not Fanny Lyle, not the larceny charge, not the escape from custody, not the fact that the woman standing beside him in his own house was at that moment a fugitive from the courts of the state of California and would remain one. He had married a biography, and she had written it herself, and there was, in 1892, no apparatus on earth capable of correcting it for him. To check her account, he would have had to know which questions to ask, which meant knowing there was something to check. Then he would have had to write to America, to a state authority 3,000 miles away, in a country with no national criminal register, about a woman who had used at least 3 names and had last been seen in Asia. And he would have had to explain to that authority why a Dutch nobleman wanted the file. And he would have had to do all of it while married to her. The barrier was never the distance. The barrier was that men of his rank did not investigate their own wives, because to investigate is to admit in advance that you might have married badly, and a man in his position could not afford to have admitted that even privately. There is also the matter of what he was getting, which the record allows us to see only in outline, but which is not nothing. She was clever. She had been formally taught French. She had read law. She had crossed the Pacific alone and lived in Shanghai and Hong Kong and Tokyo, and she arrived in a London drawing room at 23 with an account of herself that was interesting without being suspicious. A Dutch nobleman, whose social world consisted of the families his own family had always known, met a woman unlike anyone in it. She was not passing as an aristocrat. She was passing as something rarer, which was an American of good family with an unusual mind. And the beauty of that disguise is that nobody in Europe could check the good family, and nobody anywhere could counterfeit the mind. She had not fooled a stupid man. She had located the exact blind spot that his class produced in every one of its members, and stood in it. Now, most stories of this kind end at the altar, because in most stories of this kind, the marriage was the objective. A poor clever girl reaches a title and stops. May Dugas did not stop. She had not been aiming at a husband. She had been aiming at an instrument, and she had just acquired the finest one available in the 19th century. Think about what a title actually did in 1893. A baroness could take a suite anywhere on the continent without a question being asked. She could be introduced to anyone, and the introduction would be accepted, because the person making it was staking nothing. She could travel between countries without her papers being examined by anyone who felt entitled to examine them. She could meet a wealthy man socially, at a level where the question of who she was had already been answered before she entered the room, by a name in front of her own that no hotel clerk in Europe was going to interrogate. She had spent 5 years constructing credibility, one dangerous conversation at a time. The barony handed it to her wholesale, and the title solved a problem no alias ever could, which is durability. An assumed name is only good until somebody checks it, and every use of it is a fresh risk. A title conferred by marriage in a Dutch church, entered in a Dutch register, held by a woman who genuinely was the wife of the man who held the castle, was not a forgery at all. It would survive any investigation, because it was true. She had spent 5 years lying about who she was. Then she married a man. And after that, she never had to lie about it again. Everything she said about herself from November of 1892 onward was, in the strictest sense, accurate. There is a further advantage, and it is the one that made her almost impossible to prosecute. A wealthy man being quietly asked for money by a woman of no background can go to the police, and does. A wealthy man being asked for money by a baroness he has been seen with in society cannot, because the moment he explains the situation, he has also explained who he was seen with and why she has anything to ask about. The title did not merely open doors, it reversed the direction of the shame. So she kept working. The documented aliases run alongside the title for the rest of her life, and each one is a separate person with separate papers. Pauline Davidson, Pauline Townsend, Maud Jackson, Mrs. Appleby, when the Appleby business required a Mrs. Appleby, and at the very end, on a death notice, simply Marie. The estimate of what she accumulated across those decades, from blackmail and from ventures that were harder to categorize, is somewhere around $2 million. It is an estimate, and this film will call it one. Nobody audited May Dugas. But it is the figure the record supports, and it is worth holding it up against the shape of her life, because there is an arithmetic hidden inside it that she would have understood better than anyone. $2 million. Not 1 cent of it held under her own legal name. That is the money versus powerlessness gap in its purest form anywhere in this story. Gertrude Atherton could not sign a novel. May Dugas could not sign a bank book. Everything she had was in an alias, or in a companion's keeping, or in a name she had married into and could be stripped of. And the reason is not that she was a criminal. It is that she was a wife, and in 1893, the difference between a wife's property and a fiction was mostly a matter of who felt like enforcing which. The Baron began to want out in 1899. They signed a deed of separation at Antwerp in November of that year, and he agreed to pay £6,000 on signature. She never remarried under the title. She kept the name Baroness de Pallant van Eerde for the remaining 38 years of her life, and when he died, she inherited a small fortune from him besides. The marriage had lasted 7 years. The name lasted until she was in the ground. She spent the following decade being the person she had built. There are 2 lawsuits from those years that are almost too neat, because both of them turn on exactly the same question her whole existence turned on. Who owns a thing? And who is the woman claiming it? The first involves a man named Ernest Appleby, who won $50,000 at the tables at Monte Carlo, and bought the Baroness a pearl necklace with some of it. In 1914, he sued her for $20,000 over the ownership of that necklace. The case settled out of court in April of that year. The second is better. In 1912, she sued Lloyd's and the Gresham Insurance Company over a black pearl and diamond brooch that she said had been lost at the Shakespeare Ball in London. That suit settled in February of 1912. A pearl necklace whose provenance is exactly as documented as its owner's. A brooch that vanished at a costume ball. She went to law in Europe over the ownership of objects, twice in 3 years, and never once did anybody in a European courtroom ask her to establish the ownership of her own name. That question would be asked in Michigan. Chapter 7. The Baroness states her name in court. The woman who had been a name in Hong Kong hotels was made to stand up in the county where her mother still lived. The person who did that to her was not a husband, not a detective, and not a victim of one of her operations. It was a woman, and a friend, and a professional, and the fact that it was all 3 is the reason this is the best exposure in the film. Frank Gray Shaver was an attorney. The sources are explicit that Shaver was a miss, which in that era meant a woman who had done something extremely difficult to be in the room at all. She met May Dugas somewhere near Chicago around 1901, and the 2 of them became friends. The friendship had business in it from early on. Shaver assisted with a real estate transaction involving the Potash Sulphur Springs Hotel near Hot Springs in Arkansas, bought around 1901 and sold before the racetrack there opened in 1903. And it had family in it too. Around 1902, Shaver became engaged to May's brother Jean, and around 1903 she broke the engagement off because of his borrowing. Note that. The attorney could see clearly what Aduga did with other people's money, and she ended an engagement over it, and then some years later she lent money to his sister. The friendship lapsed, and Shaver resumed it in 1912, after her own father died. And what followed was not a con in the theatrical sense, with a false identity and a fake certificate. It was something slower and more intimate, and much harder to prosecute. The Baroness asked Shaver to take a half-interest in the Dugas family home in Menominee. Money moved, more money moved. It kept moving for years. By the end, Frank Gray Shaver was asking for the repayment of approximately $100,000 in loaned funds. The Baroness maintained that Shaver had signed a release absolving her of the indebtedness. Remember the syllabus: psychology, French, and business law. Of the three, it was the third that she had put to work here, and it is difficult not to see the 18-year-old in the Chicago classroom sitting somewhere behind the Baroness of 47, explaining to an attorney what a release does. There is a bleakness in this that the earlier operations do not have. The Hong Kong mining executive was a stranger with a guilty conscience and a bank balance. Frank Gray Shaver was a friend of 16 years who had been to the family house, who had nearly married into the family, and who had chosen, at a moment of her own grief, to renew the acquaintance. Whatever passed between those two women over 5 years, it was conducted at close range, and it lasted a long time. Shaver sued, alleging extortion. The trial was held in Menominee, Michigan, in 1917. This is the peak beat of her segment, and its power has nothing to do with the sums. A courtroom is a room in which a person's identity is not accepted but established, on the record, in public, by evidence, and where the first thing that happens is that you are required to state who you are. May Dugas had spent 30 years never once being in a room like that. She had crossed the Pacific on an assertion. She had entered European society on a title. She had been Pauline Davidson and Pauline Townsend and Maud Jackson and Mrs. Appleby, and each of them had held up because nobody with the power to check had ever cared enough to check. In Hong Kong, nobody asked. In Tokyo, nobody asked. At Castle Erde, of all the places in the world, nobody asked. And then a lumber town on the Wisconsin line asked. She stood up in Menominee, Michigan, in a county courthouse, in the town where she had gone to high school, where her family still lived, where there were people in the public seats who could remember the saloonkeeper who had died and the clever girl he had left, and she was required to be, on the record, in front of all of them, the person she actually was. And the town would have understood exactly what it was looking at, which is the part that cannot be repaired. Menominee had watched the Dugas family arrive after a saloonkeeper died. It had watched the clever daughter finish high school and leave. Somewhere in the years that followed, it had learned that she was a baroness, and had drawn the obvious conclusion that one of its own had married extraordinarily well. In 1917, it found out what she had married on. That was the punishment. The settlement was almost beside the point. The claim had been for approximately $100,000. The settlement required her to repay $13,515. It is a deflation, and the film should not oversell it, because the money was never what she lost in that room. A woman who had taken $25,000 out of a single mining executive in Hong Kong could find $13,500. What she could not do, ever again, was be the only author of her own history. It had been read aloud in Menominee, and Menominee had newspapers, and the newspapers had wire services. There is one more fact from 1917, and it sits in the record without explanation, and this film will not invent one. In the same year as the trial, at 47 or 48 years old, May Dugas adopted an infant boy. She named him John Andrew Van Eerde, and she took him through Europe as a child and as an adolescent, and he went to Harvard, and he became a professor of Romance languages at Lehigh University. In the Second World War, he interpreted Italian prisoner mail for Allied intelligence. He married. He had one child. He died in 2006. That is the clean life. A boy who did not know a saloon, or a lumber town, or Carrie Watson's, or a warrant, and who went to Harvard on money whose history nobody ever asked him about. She died of cancer in New York City on the 10th of March, 1937. And here is the collapse image, and it is a piece of paper, as it always is with these women. Her death certificate identified her as May de Pallant van Eerde. The newspaper notice announcing her death described her as the beloved wife, Marie, of Edward Allen Morrissey, who worked for the Zanuck Movie Company. 2 documents, the same week, the same dead woman. A Dutch baroness on the certificate and a woman called Marie in the death notice, and no reader of either one would have had the least idea that the other existed. She had run 2 lives for 45 years, and the paperwork could not agree on which of them had just ended. Her story eventually reached print, long after she could be embarrassed by it, when she told it to a Chicago Daily Tribune reporter named Lloyd Went in the 1940s, and it ran as a series from late 1946 into 1947. She had, by then, been dead for the better part of a decade, and the son she raised was a professor at an American university, with no idea, one assumes, that his mother's obituary and his mother's death certificate had disagreed about who she was. There is one thing she did that none of the other 3 managed, and it deserves to be set down before the film moves on. Sarah Howe left ruined depositors. Eva Hamilton left a bought child and a drowned man. Gertrude Atherton left books. May Dugas left a person, raised on the proceeds, who never had to do any of it, and who spent the Second World War reading other people's letters for the Allies, which is a family trade of a kind. Whatever else the second life bought her, it bought him a first one. May Dugas manufactured a past, and she manufactured it for an audience of one man, and the fortune she built on it she kept entirely to herself, in names she invented as she went. The next woman built one too, but she did not keep it to herself, and she did not manufacture it for a single husband in a single house. She manufactured an institution, put it on a Boston street with a door and a counter and a ledger, and recruited 1,200 women to keep the secret alongside her. Chapter 8. A woman with 2 marriages already erased. Before she ever opened a bank, Sarah Howe had watched 2 of her own marriages disappear out of the record. Begin with what is not known about her, because the uncertainty is the point. She was born around 1826. The sources spread across 7 years, from 1820 to 1827, and cannot be reconciled. The Boston Herald said she came from Providence, Rhode Island. Nobody has ever established it. Compare that with the other people in this film. Gertrude Atherton's birth is documented to the day. Robert Ray Hamilton's is a matter of national genealogy. May Dugas's is fixed to the 23rd of May, 1869. Sarah Howe, at the very beginning of her life, is already approximate. Then the marriages, and here the record becomes not merely thin, but actively self-erasing. There was a reported early marriage to a man named James Solomon, which was possibly annulled under a miscegenation law. Look at what that phrase actually contains. It means that a marriage this woman entered into was not dissolved by her, or by him, or by a court weighing their conduct. It was declared never to have existed at all, by operation of a statute about race, in a country that maintained such statutes for another century. A wedding took place, and then the state took an eraser to it, and afterward there had been no wedding. then a second husband, who died. That is the whole of what is recorded of him. A man, married to her, dead. And then, in 1852, at Manchester in New Hampshire, she married Florimond Howe and became Sarah Howe, which is the name history has her under. 2 marriages gone before the third began, one of them reportedly annulled out of existence by a law about who may marry whom, the other closed by a death. By the time she was 30, she had already learned, at first hand and without wanting to, the central fact that this entire film is about. That a woman's history is not a fixed thing she carries. It is a set of documents held by other people, and other people can amend them. She would spend the second half of her life amending documents herself, and she would have understood something else about that annulment which the modern ear misses. It did not only remove a husband, it removed her. A woman whose marriage is dissolved is a divorced woman, which in that century was a disaster, but was at least a status. A woman whose marriage is annulled was never married, which means the years she spent inside it were legally unoccupied. There is no widow, no wife, no former wife. There is a gap where a person used to be, and the state made it. And she had to go on living in the town where everybody remembered the wedding. If the report is right, the country she was living in had done that to her on purpose, by statute, on the grounds of who she had chosen. It is not difficult to see how a woman who had been erased by paper might conclude that paper was not sacred. This film has to be honest about a gap here, because the source record has one, and the channel's rule is to name a gap rather than paper over it. What Florimond Howe knew about his wife's business is not established. He was there. They were married for decades. Beyond that, the record is silent, and this film will not fill the silence with a scene it cannot support. The concealment in Sarah Howe's life is proven at the identity end, thoroughly and in court. Whether the man at her breakfast table was a mark, an accomplice, or simply a man who had learned not to ask, nobody can now say. Boston in the 1860s and 70s is a specific place, and it matters to what she built. It was the most self-consciously respectable city in the United States, a place that took charitable giving seriously, that had a genuine Quaker presence and a long abolitionist conscience, and where a benevolent fund quietly endowed for the relief of women of small means was not merely plausible, but was the exact kind of thing the city liked to believe about itself. It was also a city with a great many unmarried women in it, living on their own wages, with no husband coming and no father living, saving against an old age that nobody else was going to fund. Sarah Howe did not have to invent her market. She simply had to be the first person to treat it as one. After the Civil War, the Howes came to Boston, and Sarah Howe took up a trade. She became a fortune teller. It is easy to hear that as colour and to move on, and it should not be. Clairvoyance was one of the very few occupations available to a woman of no capital in 1860s America that required no employer, no premises beyond a room, no license, and no husband's countersignature. A woman could set up as a medium on Monday and be trading by Tuesday. The era was saturated with spiritualism. Respectable people consulted mediums. The practice sat in the culture somewhere between religion and medicine and entertainment, and its customers were overwhelmingly women. So the trade she chose was this. Women came to her, privately, with money in their hands, and paid her to tell them what their futures held. Hold that sentence. She would be running the same business years later, at 8% a month, with a counter and a ledger and 1,200 customers. It also gave her something no bank could have given her, which was 15 years of practical education in what women were frightened of. A fortune teller in 1860s Boston did not deal in vague prophecy. Her customers came with specific fears, and she learned all of them. Whether the money would last, whether there would be a husband, whether the brother in the West would send anything, what would happen when the mother died and the house was sold, whether an unmarried woman of 38 with $300 and no prospects was going to end her life in somebody's back room or in the poorhouse. She sat opposite those women, one at a time, for years, and she listened to them describe exactly what they needed and could not get. Then she built it. That is why the Ladies' Deposit Company was so precisely shaped to its market. It was not a general swindle that happened to attract women. It was designed, feature by feature, by somebody who had spent a decade and a half being told, in confidence, by hundreds of women, what would make them feel safe. The first collision with the law came in 1875. She was jailed for several weeks over loans she had taken out against identical collateral, pledging the same security to more than one lender. The conviction was overturned on appeal. It is a small offence and a technical one, and it matters for exactly one reason. It is a rehearsal. The mechanism of the 1875 loans and the mechanism of the Ladies' Deposit Company are the same mechanism. Promise the same thing twice. Rely on the fact that the two people you promised it to will never compare notes. The difference in 1879 would be that she found a category of customer that could be relied upon not to compare notes, because she made non-comparison the price of entry. She had, by the end of that decade, everything she needed. She had a trade that consisted of selling the future to women. She had a conviction that had been wiped off her record on appeal, a marriage reported to have been wiped off it by statute, and a husband who had died out of it, all of which had taught her how mutable a woman's paper history really was. She had a Boston full of unmarried women with small savings and nowhere respectable to put them. And she had one insight that nobody else in the city had bothered to have. Chapter 9. A bank that only unmarried women may enter. It paid 2% a week, it never advertised, and every depositor was told to tell nobody. The Ladies' Deposit Company was open for business by April of 1879, and its terms deserved to be set out one at a time, slowly, because each one is doing a specific piece of work, and the whole design only becomes visible when they are laid side by side. It accepted deposits only from unmarried women. Married women were not eligible. This was not presented as a restriction. It was presented as the entire purpose. It paid 2% a week. Later, the rate was restated as 8% a month. Either way, a woman who put in $100 was being told she would have doubled it inside a year. It was underwritten, the depositors were told, by a Quaker charitable fund, endowed by a wealthy benefactor for the assistance of women of modest means. The fund was the reason the returns were possible. The fund was the reason no man was involved. The fund was the moral architecture of the entire enterprise. There was no fund. There had never been a fund. There was no benefactor, no endowment, and no Quaker. And it never advertised. Not once. It grew entirely by referral, woman to woman, spoken aloud in parlours and boarding houses and church halls and behind counters, from a depositor who had been paid to a friend who had not yet heard. It took in approximately $500,000 from about 1,200 depositors in Boston and in Chicago, and as far away as Washington. Now the scale of it, because the numbers are what make the human damage legible. $500,000 in 1880, 1,200 women. That is an average of a little over $400 apiece, and $400 was not a woman's spare cash. For most of them, it was years of saving, or an inheritance from a mother, or the entire proceeds of a life spent working in other people's houses. It was the money that stood between an unmarried woman of that era and the poorhouse, and there were 1,200 of them. The mechanism underneath was the oldest one there is. New deposits paid the old interest. That is all it ever was. Every dollar the lady's deposit handed out as a magnificent return was a dollar another woman had handed in that week, and the arrangement can survive only while the inflow rises, and the inflow can only rise while nobody counts. The arrangement now carries the name of Charles Ponzi. Sarah Howe was running it 4 decades before he made it famous. And the rate tells you she knew exactly what she was doing, because 2% a week is not a plausible return badly estimated. It is an impossible return, deliberately chosen. No lawful enterprise on earth was generating money at that speed, and every banker in Boston knew it. A rate like that is not designed to be believed by somebody weighing investments. It is designed to be believed by somebody who has been told that this is not an investment at all, but a charity, funded by a benefactor, distributing money to women who need it. The absurd rate and the fictional Quaker fund were not 2 separate lies. They were one lie, and each half made the other survivable. But the finance is not the interesting part, and this film is not about a fraud. It is about a second life, and the second life is the design of the thing. Every other woman in this story built a concealment and then hoped nobody would look at it. Gertrude Atherton hid a name from her family. May Dugas hid a past from a husband. Both of them were, at every moment, one curious person away from the end. Sarah Howe did something categorically different. She did not build a secret and hope. She built a secret and then recruited 1,200 people to hold it with her by making silence a condition of membership. Depositors were told to tell no one. Read that instruction the way they would have received it, because they did not hear it as suspicious. They heard it as consistent. A charitable fund for women of small means, quietly endowed, deliberately unadvertised, is a thing that would ask for discretion. Charity of that period was supposed to be discreet. A benefactor who wanted no notice, helping women who wanted no pity, through an institution that did not advertise. The secrecy was not a crack in the story. It was the story's best feature. And then look at who she selected, and understand that this is not a fraud that happened to be aimed at women. It is a fraud that could not have been aimed at anyone else. Unmarried women had legal capacity that married women lacked. A single woman could contract, hold property, and deposit money in her own name, which a wife in most of the country still could not do in any practical sense. So the pool was the only pool in America of women with money that was legally, unarguably theirs. Unmarried women had savings nobody else was managing. There was no husband examining the passbook, no father administering a trust, no brother taking an interest. The money was theirs, and it was invisible. Unmarried women had every social reason in the world not to discuss their finances in public. A single woman of small means in 1879 Boston did not announce what she had. To announce it was to invite either pity or predation, and she had spent her adult life learning to avoid both, and unmarried women had almost nowhere to go. The banks of the period were institutions run by men for men, in rooms where a woman with $400 was an inconvenience to be managed politely and quickly. There was, in the whole of that city, no financial institution that treated a woman's money as her own serious business, until there was. That is the thing the film has to say plainly, and it is what makes the lady's deposit so much colder than an ordinary swindle. Sarah Howe did not exploit a weakness in these women. She identified, precisely and correctly, the single largest unmet need among the unmarried women of Boston, and she met it. For 18 months, the Ladies' Deposit Company was the only place in Massachusetts where a woman without a husband could walk in with her own money, be taken seriously, be handed a book with her own name in it, and be treated as a person with a financial future. Every part of that was true, except the money. She had read the era's rule about women and money more accurately than any banker in Boston, and she built the business the rule created. Then she took the proceeds. For a year and a half it worked, and the reason it worked is written into the referral pattern. The women brought each other. A depositor who had received her interest, in cash, in her hand, told a friend, and the friend came, and the friend's money paid the next month's interest to the first woman, and both of them went away satisfied and told nobody. There is one more feature of the design worth naming, and it is the cruelest. Because the depositors were forbidden to discuss it, none of them could ever check the story against anybody else's version. A woman who was told about the Quaker Fund had no way of discovering that her friend 2 streets away had been told the same thing in the same words, or of noticing that neither of them had ever met a Quaker connected with it, or of asking the obvious question about why a charity would be paying 8% a month rather than simply giving the money away. The rule that made them feel chosen was the rule that kept them from comparing notes. 1,200 names, each one required to be unmarried, none of them permitted to speak of it, kept in a ledger by a woman with 2 erased marriages behind her. Chapter 10. The line of women outside the door. In September 1880, the Boston Daily Advertiser printed what the ladies' deposit actually was, and the run began within days. There is a particular horror to the collapse of a scheme built on silence, and it is this. The instruction that had protected it was also the instruction that meant none of the depositors knew each other. 1,200 women had been told to tell no one, and they had obeyed. And so, on the morning the advertiser appeared, each of them discovered simultaneously and separately that she was not the only one. They came to the door. That is the image from this segment, and it is the one that has to be got right, because it is very easy to make it contemptuous, and it must not be. A line of women outside a Boston counting house in the autumn of 1880, waiting to be told whether the money was there. Not fools, not fantasists. Women who had put $400 into the only institution in the city that had ever addressed them as depositors rather than as somebody's daughter, and who had been paid reliably every month, exactly as promised, for as long as a year and a half. They had not been credulous. They had been correct, right up until they were not, which is the same experience every investor in every collapse has ever had. And most of them were not going to get it back, because there was nothing to get. The money had been paid out again as interest, month after month, to the women who had joined earliest, which means that a small number of Boston's unmarried women had done extremely well out of the Ladies' Deposit Company, and that every dollar of their profit had come out of the savings of the ones standing in that line. Sarah Howe had not merely robbed 1,200 women, she had arranged for them to rob each other in order by date of entry, and had taken a commission on the process, and the terms had been checkable from the first week. Nothing about the Ladies' Deposit Company was hidden. The rate was stated. The charitable fund was named as its foundation. Anybody willing to ask what endowment could pay 2% a week, and who exactly the benefactor was, had all the information required. Any banker in Boston could have done that in an afternoon at any point in the preceding 18 months. None of them did, and the reason is the reason this segment exists. The Ladies' Deposit Company was a financial institution serving 1,200 women in a city whose financial press did not consider women's money to be finance. It was beneath the notice of the people whose notice would have saved them. The company failed in October of 1880. Sarah Howe was convicted on multiple counts of fraud and served 3 years. And that is where the story of an ordinary swindler ends. She is caught, she is sentenced, she is diminished into a paragraph. Sarah Howe came out in 1884 and did it again. The second institution was called the Women's Bank. It was the same model, with one adjustment. The rate came down from 8% a month to 7%. It took in an estimated $50,000. It was exposed in April of 1887, and she left Boston before the indictment could be handed down. The second attempt is the one that tells you what she actually was. A first fraud can be explained a dozen forgiving ways. Desperation. A scheme that got away from its author. A woman who believed for a while that the returns would somehow materialize. The second one cannot. She had been convicted. She had served 3 years. She knew from the inside precisely what the arrangement did to the women at the end of the line, because she had been in a courtroom while it was described. And after her release, she opened the same institution again, on the same terms, in the same city, to the same population. The only alteration she made was to lower the rate by 1%, which is not a moral adjustment, it is a technical one. 8% a month had collapsed the first company faster than it needed to. 7 would buy more time. She had gone to prison and come out having learned nothing except how to slow the failure down. Then Chicago, where she tried the same thing again under the name Ladies' Provident Aid. She was arrested in Boston in December of 1888 and released in March of 1889 because the victims refused to prosecute. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the strangest fact in this segment and possibly in the film. Women she had taken money from would not stand up in a courtroom and say so. There are reasons a person might not, and they are all bleak. Shame at having believed. Unwillingness to have a private failure entered into a public record. The knowledge that a prosecution would return not $1. And, for a certain number of them, the entirely rational calculation that a single woman in 1889, who was known to have been swindled, would be treated by the world as a woman who could not manage money, which was precisely the belief that had shut her out of every real bank in the first place. The secrecy she had sold them outlived the scheme. She had told them not to tell anyone, and even after it was over, some of them still would not. There is a further reason, and it is the one that should be sat with longest. To prosecute, a woman would have had to stand up in a public courtroom in Boston and state, on the record, the exact sum she had put in and where it had come from, which meant announcing what she was worth, or had been worth, or had spent 30 years accumulating in service in a city where an unmarried woman's finances were nobody's business, precisely because they were her only protection. The privacy Sarah Howe had sold them was real. It was the most valuable thing she gave them. It was the reason they had come to her rather than to a bank. And at the end, it was the thing that stopped them from getting their money back. And there is a last measure of what she had built, which is what happened to the design after her. 2 institutions carried it: the Ladies' Deposit Company and the Women's Bank. A third scheme in Chicago carried the shape of it under the name Ladies' Provident Aid. 3 attempts across a decade in 2 cities, aimed every time at the same population, and every time she got money out of it. The idea worked. It kept working after she had been to prison for it and after her name had been printed in the Boston papers. That is not a comment on the women who believed it. It is a comment on how badly they needed the thing she was pretending to offer, and on the fact that nobody honest ever offered it to them. She went back to telling fortunes. That is how it ends. Not with a flight to Europe, not with a hidden fortune, not with a last great score. The woman who had taken $500,000 off 1,200 women went back to a room in Boston and resumed selling the future to individual customers at whatever a session cost, which is the trade she had started in 20 years earlier. And she did it until she died. She died on the 26th of January, 1892. 66 years old, or thereabouts, in a city where 1,200 women knew her name, and none of them would say it. She was buried at Forest Hills Cemetery in Jamaica Plain. The $5 burial fee was paid by a stranger. That is the collapse to a single image for Sarah Howe, and it needs no assistance. $500,000 passed through her hands. 1,200 women trusted her with the whole of what they had. 2 banks carried her design, and a third scheme carried her name. And at the end of it, there was not $5 in the world that belonged to her, and somebody who did not know her paid to put her in the ground. What she counterfeited, in the end, was not money. Any thief takes money. What Sarah Howe counterfeited was an institution, which is to say a promise made by something larger than a person, and she made 1,200 women complicit in keeping it standing by telling them that the promise was theirs alone. The last woman in this film counterfeited something smaller and infinitely worse. Not a bank, not a past. A pregnancy, a brother, and a child. Bought off a New York street for $10 and written into one of the oldest names in America. Chapter 11. A meeting on a Manhattan sidewalk. The sources cannot even agree which street it happened on, and everything that followed came out of it. 43rd, 44th, 45th. Somewhere in those 3 blocks of Manhattan, at some point in the middle of the 1880s, a woman met a man on the sidewalk, and 5 years later, a purchased infant was carrying the surname of Alexander Hamilton. That the street cannot be fixed is not a failure of research. It is the first fact about Eva Hamilton, and it is characteristic of everything the record does with her. The man is documented to the day of his birth, the college he attended, the district he represented, and the dollar figure of his annual income. The woman is a range of streets. Her name, before any of it, was Evangeline Steele. She was born around 1858, and this film is not going to pretend to a year because the record does not supply one. Elmira, in upstate New York, is where she came from and where she would later go back to. And beyond that, her origins are not recoverable. This is worth stating plainly, rather than smoothing over, because it changes how the rest of the story has to be told. With Gertrude Atherton, there is a wound, and it can be named. A dissolved household, an aunt who would not take her. With May Dugar, there is a wound, and it can be named. A dead saloonkeeper and a clever girl in a lumber town. With Eva Hamilton, there is nothing. No documented childhood, no recorded loss, no first humiliation to hold the later conduct against. The film will not invent one. What can be said is structural rather than personal, and it is this. She was a woman with no money, no standing, and no legal self, and she worked out that the only asset available to her in that condition was another person's belief. By the middle of the 1880s, she was living in the New York boarding house world, and she was married. Her husband was Joshua Mann. He was called Josh, and he was also called Dottie, and he will be in the room for nearly every scene that follows. Attached to him, and just as permanent, was his mother, Anna Swinton, who was called grandmother by people who had no business calling her anything of the kind. She is the figure the record places closest to the infants in that house, and she is the one who helped keep the surviving child alive. The boarding house world these 3 lived in is worth a moment, because it was an entire economy, and it has almost completely vanished from the way the period is now imagined. A boarding house was a private residence let out by the room, with meals provided at fixed hours at a common table, and it housed clerks, actors, salesmen, widows, students, and a very large floating population of people whose circumstances did not bear inspection. Nobody in a boarding house had a lease. Nobody had a servant who had known them since childhood. There were no family portraits on the walls, and no relatives 2 streets away who could confirm anything. You were, in a boarding house, exactly and only what you said you were, and you could be somebody else in a different house on a different street by the end of the week. For a woman constructing a second self, it was the ideal terrain. and Eva Hamilton lived in it for years. One of them could reach the cellars, and one of them could be a brother, and one of them could be believed. Between the three of them, they had every component of the operation except a mark. Now the other side of the sidewalk. Robert Ray Hamilton was born on the 18th of March, 1851, and he has to be built to his full height here, because the height is the entire reason the fall is vertical. His great-grandfather was Alexander Hamilton. His great-grandmother was Elizabeth Schuyler Hamilton. His grandfather was John Church Hamilton, and his father was General Schuyler Hamilton. There is no more American pedigree available. He was descended from the man on the currency through a line that had spent a century keeping the name in good repair. He went to Columbia College and then to Columbia Law School, and he practiced law. He was a Republican. He ran for alderman in 1879 and lost, which is the only ordinary thing in his file. He sat in the New York State Assembly for the 11th District in 1881, and again from 1886 through 1889. He was a delegate to the Republican National Convention of 1888, and he had, from his maternal grandfather Robert Ray, an income of approximately $40,000 a year. Set that figure against the other numbers in this story. $40,000 a year was arriving before he did a day's work, before a single legal fee or a cent of legislative salary, and it arrived whether he rose from his bed or not. The wife he was about to take would be given $6,000 of it. The child that made the marriage happen would cost $10,000. That is the kind of money that removes a man from the necessity of ever being careful. He had never in his life had to verify anything. Nothing had ever depended on his checking. He was also, on the shape of the record, a solitary man. He was in his middle 30s and unmarried when the sidewalk meeting is supposed to have taken place, in a class and a decade in which a man of his name and income was expected to have married somebody suitable and to be producing the next generation of Hamiltons. He had not. He sat in the assembly, he practiced law, and he kept a woman in a boarding house on 14th Street for 5 years, rather than presenting anybody to his family. That is not the profile of a man being hunted for his money by a stranger. It is the profile of a man who had already arranged his life so that the most important relationship in it was one nobody could see, and had done it years before anyone asked him for anything. He was not a fool, and this film is not going to make him one, because a fool is not interesting and is also not what the record shows. He was a Columbia-trained lawyer who sat in a legislature and drafted statutes for a living. He knew what a marriage was, legally, and what a birth was, and what an heir was. He simply had no working experience of being lied to about anything that mattered, because the world he had been born into did not present him with people who needed to. He met a woman on a sidewalk, and he believed what she told him, and he went on believing it for 5 years, and it cost him his name, his marriage, and, in a way that cannot be proved, but also cannot be entirely dismissed, his life. The name is the thing to keep in view throughout what follows, because it explains the scale of what happened afterward. There were richer men in New York in 1889. There were more powerful ones. There was not a more symbolic one. Alexander Hamilton was, by the 1880s, fully installed in the national story. The immigrant who built the Treasury, the man of the Federalist Papers, the figure at the center of the country's founding argument about money. His descendants were not merely wealthy people. They were a kind of public property, and his great-grandson sat in a legislature and carried the name in a state whose commercial supremacy that man had designed. Which is precisely why a woman with nothing could look at him and see, correctly, that a child bearing that surname would never be quietly disposed of. The name was the asset. She was not stealing from the estate. She was manufacturing an heir to it. By her own account, given to a newspaper in 1889, he paid all her expenses across those 5 years before the marriage. That is the arrangement the whole construction rested on. Not a wedding, not a settlement, not a legal obligation of any kind. A wealthy man, quietly maintaining a woman in a boarding house for years on an understanding that was never written down, which is exactly the kind of arrangement that leaves no paper and cannot be audited and does not require anybody to be introduced to anybody else. He was keeping her, and in the boarding house he was keeping her in, there was already a husband, and there was already a mother-in-law, and there was already a plan. Chapter 12. The brother who was her husband. She did not hide Joshua Mann from Robert Ray Hamilton. She moved him into the house and called him a relative. This is the detail that separates Eva Hamilton from every other woman in this film, and probably from most of the women in the criminal record of the period. The instinct of a person maintaining a double life is to keep the two halves apart. Every other subject here did exactly that. Atherton kept a pen name out of a drawing room. Dugas kept Michigan out of the Netherlands. Howe kept 1,200 depositors from meeting each other. Eva Hamilton did the opposite. She brought her real husband into the marriage and sat him at the table. The base of the operation was a boarding house at 208 East 14th Street in Manhattan, and the household inside it consisted of Eva, Joshua Mann, and Anna Swinton. Hamilton's money paid for it. Mann lived on it, ate on it, and travelled on it for years as a relative of the woman his benefactor was keeping. And here is the part that is difficult to read without flinching, and which comes from her own mouth. Speaking to the New York World in October of 1889, she described how the arrangement was put to Hamilton. Her words: "I told him I wanted to take Josh Mann for company, and he said it was all right." That is the whole architecture in 18 words. She asked her husband's permission to bring her husband, and he gave it. It is worth being clear about why that worked, because it did not work by luck. It worked because of exactly the social machinery this film opened with. A man of Robert Ray Hamilton's class did not investigate the domestic arrangements of a woman he was keeping. To investigate would have been to acknowledge, in a documentable way, that the arrangement existed. The whole point of the boarding house on East 14th Street was that it was somewhere he did not have to look closely. She understood that better than he did. There is another reading available, and honesty requires putting it up, because the record does not exclude it. Joshua Mann was not a strong character by any account that survives. He was called Dottie. He lived for years on another man's money in a house run by his mother and his wife, and when the whole thing collapsed, he did not defend her, and by 1893 he had sued her for divorce. It is at least possible that the person being managed inside that boarding house was Mann, and that a woman who had married young into a family with a specialty had worked out how to run it herself. Eva later claimed exactly that, and the film will come to her version. What can be said now is that all three of them were living on Robert Ray Hamilton, and only one of them ever went to prison for it. Then, after about 3 years, she told him she was pregnant. She had never been pregnant. The construction that followed is the most elaborate in this film, and it should be taken slowly and in sequence, because the horror of it is procedural. It is not a crime of passion. It is a project with stages and a supply problem and quality control. Stage 1 was the withdrawal. A pregnancy requires a confinement, and a confinement requires a place he would not visit. So she left New York for Elmira, and she gave him a reason to accept the address. Her words, again from the world: "I slipped off to Elmira, to my brothers, a Mr. Steele, who lived in 3rd Street. A brother, on 3rd Street. Mr. Steele, which was her own name before Mann, deployed now as a fictitious male relative with a house in a distant town. Elmira was a real place, and a well-chosen one. It was upstate, large enough that a woman could be anonymous in it, and small enough that a wealthy New York legislator was never going to arrive unannounced. It was also, and this is the part that suggests real care, the place she actually came from, which meant that if she ever had to describe a street or a church or a shop, she would not stumble. The best lies are mostly true, and she had built this one out of her own childhood. She had already installed one man in her life who was not what she called him. She now invented a second one who did not exist at all. Stage 2 was the money, and the money is what makes this a Gilded Age story rather than a police story. Hamilton, in New York, believing his child was on the way in upstate New York, sent her funds, not an allowance, not a settlement. Cash, in lumps, as requested, $500 to $1,500 at a time. Set those sums against the $6,000 a year, he would shortly settle on her as an entire annual income. He was sending a quarter of that figure at a time, more than once, to a woman in another town, on the strength of a pregnancy that was not occurring. It is the clearest illustration in the film of what $40,000 a year does to a man's sense of proportion. He was not being ruined by these payments. He was barely noticing them. Stage 3 was the account she gave of the birth, and it is the coldest thing she ever said because of how carefully it is constructed. Her words: "On November 15th, I slipped away and went to some good, honest people in the country. On the 19th, my baby was born." Read it as a piece of writing. There is a date of departure and a date of delivery, 4 days apart, which is precisely the kind of detail an inventor supplies, and a truthful person usually does not. There is a location that cannot be checked, the country, and there are witnesses who cannot be named, some good, honest people. She has furnished a scene with everything a listener needs to believe it, and nothing anybody could go and verify. And there is the phrase, "my baby was born," which was, in the narrowest possible sense, true. A baby had been born. Somewhere in New York, to somebody, 4 infants were born across those months, and every one of them was for sale. And notice the logistical problem she had created for herself, because it is the reason 4 children were required rather than 1. A pregnancy announced in the spring produces a baby at a fixed date, and the baby has to be the right age, and it has to stay alive, and it has to be produced on demand for a man who might travel to Elmira at any time. She was not shopping. She was running a supply chain with a delivery deadline she had set herself and a specification she could not alter in a market with no guarantees and no returns policy except the one she exercised. Stage 4 was the acquisition, and that is the next chapter, because it deserves its own. But before it, the point of the whole exercise, which the police understood immediately and which the newspapers took several weeks to arrive at. None of this was about a wedding. Eva already had a husband. She did not need another. What she needed was a child, and specifically a child that Robert Ray Hamilton believed was his, because a man of that name and that fortune, presented with his own daughter, does 2 things. He marries the mother to legitimize the girl, and he writes the girl into his will. The marriage was not the objective. The marriage was the delivery mechanism for the estate. That is why the child had to be a child, and not a claim. A mistress can be denied. A promise can be broken. A woman who says a rich man is the father of her baby can be paid off, or ignored, or destroyed in a newspaper. And in the 1880s, she usually was. But a daughter, born in wedlock, acknowledged, named, and written into the settlement of a family trust, is not a claim on a fortune. She is a share of it, enforceable in a court, by lawyers, against the objections of relatives, for the rest of her life. And the mother of such a daughter is not a woman anybody can send away. Eva had been kept for 5 years on nothing but goodwill, in a boarding house, at a man's pleasure, with no document anywhere in the state of New York that obliged him to give her another dollar. She solved that problem permanently, with a child she did not bear, in a marriage to a man she could not legally marry. She was not building a second family for love, or for company, or out of some romantic disorder of the kind the papers would later enjoy attributing to her. She was building an heir, and the raw material for an heir, in the New York of 1888, could be obtained for the price of a good dinner. Chapter 13. 4 babies and one that passes. The first infant was bought in December 1888 for $10, and it died, reportedly of starvation, because a woman who has never been pregnant cannot nurse. There is no way to soften that, and this film is not going to try. What it will do is stay cold and stay procedural, and refuse to make a spectacle of 4 dead or discarded children for the sake of atmosphere. The facts are enough. They are, in fact, more than enough. The buying was done out of that household. The trade it was buying in was real and documented, and this film needs to establish it before the sequence, because a modern viewer will not otherwise believe the price. There was, in the New York of the late 1880s, a functioning market in newborn infants. Children were sold. Baby farming, as the period called it, was a known and occasionally prosecuted trade, and it existed because the alternatives available to an unmarried woman who had given birth were so much worse. A newborn could be obtained in that city by a person who knew where to ask for a few dollars. The reporter Nellie Bly proved it by doing it. She went out into New York in the course of her work and bought an infant to demonstrate that the market existed and what it charged. The price she paid was $10. It is important to understand who was on the other side of that transaction, because this film is not going to leave 4 infants as props in somebody else's scheme. Every one of those children had a mother. In the New York of 1888, an unmarried woman who gave birth faced a set of options that were all catastrophic: dismissal from service, refusal by her family, the street, an institution, or a lifetime of explaining a child to every employer she ever approached. There were charities, and they were overwhelmed and often punitive. There was no assistance from the state worth the name. So there was a market, and the market cleared at a few dollars, and the women selling into it were not monsters. They were doing the only arithmetic available to them, which means the $10 is not just a shocking price. It is a measurement. It is what the richest city in the Western Hemisphere had decided a poor woman's newborn was worth, and Eva Hamilton did not set that figure. She simply found it and used it. That is the number this entire film turns on, and it is the number a journalist paid to prove the thing was possible. $10. Roughly 2 hours of what Robert Ray Hamilton received, waking and sleeping, every hour of the year, from a trust his grandfather had left him. And it is worth pausing on the household that made this possible, because a single woman could not have done it. It required somebody who could reach the cellars. It required somebody to be the invented brother, or at least to keep the invented brother's story straight, which was Joshua Mann. It required a woman in Elmira who could be visited if necessary, and a boarding house in New York that would not ask. It required, at minimum, 4 separate transactions with 4 separate mothers or intermediaries, each of whom had to be paid and then never heard from again. This was not a woman's private madness. It was a family business, and it had a division of labor. Now the sequence. The first child was bought in December of 1888 for $10. It died. The reported cause was starvation, because Eva, who had never been pregnant, could not nurse it, and whatever arrangements were made instead were not adequate. Its death was registered. The certificate recorded the child as Alice Mann, daughter of George and Alice Mann. Look at that document, because it is the controlling metaphor of this film in its most literal form. A death certificate exists in the state of New York for a baby called Alice Mann. There was no Alice Mann. There was no George Mann. The mother's name is invented, the father's name is invented, and the child's name is invented, and the child is real and dead. A name written in another hand. Hamilton was never told the child had died. As far as he knew, his daughter was alive in Elmira, which means that for some weeks in the winter of 1888 and 1889, a man in New York was writing letters about and sending money for and making plans around a baby who was already buried under a false name in a city he could have reached in an afternoon. That is the coldest interval in this story, and nothing in the record suggests anybody in the boarding house found it remarkable. They simply went back out and bought another one. The second child was also obtained and also died, and Hamilton never saw it at all. The third child was rejected. This is the moment. Of everything in this story, this is the one that should stop a viewer, and it does not involve a death. The third infant was brought to the house, and it was looked at, and it was declined, on the grounds that it was, in the phrasing that comes down through the record, too dark complexioned and black-eyed. It would not do. It would not pass as the daughter of Robert Ray Hamilton. So it was handed back. Think about what that transaction actually was. A newborn child, alive, held up and examined by adults who were assessing whether its face was a sufficiently good likeness of a family it had no connection to, and then returned to the seller as unsuitable stock. It failed an audition. It failed to look enough like a Hamilton, and the people who had bought it that morning went back out to find one that did. And note what the rejection reveals about the specification, because the specification is the ugliest fact in this film. The requirement was not health, it was not temperament or size, or whether the child was likely to survive the winter. The requirement was that it should look like the right sort of American. A darker child could not be presented to Robert Ray Hamilton as his daughter, not for want of love, but because the fiction would not have held in front of his family, his lawyers, and eventually a probate court. The colour line ran straight through that boarding house on East 14th Street and decided which infant lived in a mansion and which went back into the trade, and it was drawn by a woman with no money looking at a baby and calculating what a rich family would accept. The fourth child was a girl. She cost $10. She was kept alive with Anna Swinton's help, which is the one piece of competence anybody in this household displayed. They named her Beatrice Ray Hamilton. Eva brought her back to New York and presented her to Robert Ray Hamilton at the boarding house at 208 East 14th Street. And a day or two later, on the 7th of January, 1889, at Paterson in New Jersey, he married her. Before the wedding, he had agreed to give her $6,000 a year for pin money and to cover her expenses at home. Stand at the middle of that week and look at what each person in it believed. Robert Ray Hamilton, of Columbia Law School and the New York State Assembly, believed he was doing the decent thing by a woman he had kept for 5 years and by a daughter he had fathered. He was legitimizing a child and settling an income on a wife. Eva believed correctly that she had just converted $10 into a claim on one of the largest private fortunes in New York. Joshua Mann, her actual husband, was somewhere in the building, and Beatrice, who was a few weeks old, had just been given the surname of Alexander Hamilton, and she would keep it, and no adult in the room had any idea who her parents were. She was, from that afternoon, legally the daughter of a Hamilton and the presumptive heir to a share of the Ray estate, and there was no document anywhere in the state of New York that told the truth about her. It had taken 1 month from the first purchase in December to the wedding in January, and it had cost $10 apiece for the 2 infants, the record prices, plus whatever was paid to the sellers and the intermediaries, against an estate throwing off $40,000 a year. As returns go, nothing on Wall Street in that decade came close. The only thing wrong with it was that every part of it depended on nobody ever asking a single question, and it had already survived the 4 hardest months it was ever going to face. And for a while, it was, by all appearances, a marriage. There was a house, and a wife, and a nurse engaged for the baby, and a summer at the shore like any other family of that class in that decade. Robert Ray Hamilton had a daughter to come home to. Eva Hamilton had the name, the income, and the standing, and had achieved in 5 years what the entire dollar princess apparatus of the Gilded Age existed to achieve for girls who had been raised for it since birth. The only difference was that everything underneath it was manufactured, and that 3 people knew, and that one of them was in the house eating at the table. For 7 months, it held. Chapter 14. A quarrel about the allowance. The marriage ended in Atlantic City on August 26, 1889, in an argument about how much money she was to be given, not about the babies, not about Josh Mann, not about Elmira or Mr. Steele of 3rd Street, or the death certificate for a child called Alice Mann. None of that had been discovered. The construction was still standing. It came down over the allowance, which is the only possible ending, because the allowance was the mechanism the whole marriage had been built to capture, and the only thing in it either party actually wanted to discuss. They were summering at Atlantic City. She wanted to live permanently in Manhattan. He refused, and he threatened to reduce what he gave her. There was a nurse in the household, Mary Ann Donnelly, engaged to look after Beatrice. Eva had told Hamilton to discharge her. He had not. On the 26th of August, Donnelly came back to the cottage, and the argument that was already running collided with her arrival. Eva stabbed her with a knife. Hamilton was cut twice trying to get between them. Mary Ann Donnelly survived. That is established by the charge laid in the courtroom afterward. Eva Hamilton was tried for atrocious assault and battery, and a woman who has killed somebody is not tried for assault. Her defense was that Donnelly had been drinking and had attacked her first. Atlantic City in August of 1889 is worth seeing for a moment because the setting is part of the story. It was a resort at the height of its first great boom, reachable from Philadelphia and New York by rail in a few hours, and it existed to be exactly what the Hamiltons were using it for. A place where families of means took a cottage for the season, walked on the boards, were seen, and went home. It was respectability at the seaside, and in one of those rented cottages, on a summer afternoon, a New York State Assemblyman was cut twice trying to pull his wife off the woman hired to look after a child he believed was his daughter. She was tried at Mays Landing in New Jersey in September of 1889, and she was sentenced to 2 years in the state prison at Trenton. 2 years, for a stabbing, is a light sentence, and the reason is instructive. New Jersey was not trying the interesting case. It had a wounded servant, a knife, a quarrel, and a defense of self-protection against a woman who had been drinking, and it disposed of the matter as an assault between 2 women in a rented cottage. Everything that made Eva Hamilton extraordinary was outside the indictment. The bigamy was somebody else's jurisdiction. The purchased children were a New York matter. What the estate would do about a daughter who was not a daughter was a question for a probate court, and the record does not settle how it was answered. The court that finally got its hands on her sentenced her for the one thing she did that had nothing to do with the plan. And then the second thing happened, which was far larger than the first, and which she had not planned for at all. The arrest opened the file. For 8 weeks, the newspapers of the United States took the architecture apart in public, piece by piece, in front of a readership that could not get enough of it. That she was already married. That the brother in the house was the husband. That there had been no pregnancy. That there had been a purchase, and then another purchase, and then a rejection, and then a fourth purchase. That the daughter of Robert Ray Hamilton, great-great-granddaughter on paper of Alexander Hamilton, had been acquired for $10 from strangers. And here is the irony that runs underneath the entire collapse. Everything she had built was designed to withstand investigation. The invented brother, the distant town, the 4-day gap between departure and delivery, the paid intermediaries, the false certificate. Every element of it was engineered against the possibility that somebody would one day look into her. Nobody ever did look into her. Not Hamilton, not his lawyers, not his family, not the state of New York, not in 5 years. The construction was not discovered. It was interrupted by a quarrel about pocket money and a knife in a rented cottage at a seaside resort. And it came apart, not through anyone's cleverness, but because a woman lost her temper in front of witnesses in a jurisdiction that kept records. It is difficult now to reconstruct how enormous this was. It combined a founding name, a serving legislator, a stabbing at a seaside resort, bigamy, and a trade in infants. And it arrived in a decade when the New York papers were inventing the modern art of the sustained scandal. For most of the autumn of 1889, this was the story. Nellie Bly, who had bought an infant for $10 to prove the market existed, went to interview the woman who had bought 4. And Eva gave her a version. In her account, Beatrice was her own child, genuinely hers, born to her. In her account, it was Swinton and Mann who had bought babies, and who had then used the knowledge to blackmail her, threatening to disclose her past unless she kept paying them. In her account, she had been pregnant 3 times by Robert Ray since they met, and he had given her $300 on the first 2 occasions to consult a doctor. There is a detail in the timing worth holding on to. Nellie Bly had gone into the New York streets and purchased a newborn for $10 in order to prove to her readers that such a market existed. She then sat down opposite a woman who had used that market 4 times, and the 2 of them discussed it. One of them had done it to expose the trade. The other had done it to acquire a fortune. They had paid the same price. This film puts her version on the table and leaves it there. It is very probably not true, but she is the only person in this story whose account we have in her own voice, and a documentary that discards her testimony because it finds her contemptible has decided in advance which people are allowed to speak. Everything else in this segment comes from men, from lawyers, from a court, from reporters, from an estate. This is hers. And there is one thread in it that is not obviously false. She had been in the boarding house with Swinton and Mann for years, and they had a specialty, and there is no version of these events in which those 2 are innocent bystanders. She may have been the architect. She was certainly not working alone. Her own accounting of the money is on the record too, and it is oddly domestic. $9,000 from him, which she said she intended to put toward a house she had bought at Passaic Bridge in New Jersey. Her diamonds, she said, were only worth $1,500, and most of them she had owned already. A house at Passaic Bridge, in New Jersey, bought in her own name? That is the tell, and it is the one thing in the whole affair she got right. Everything else she built was performance, and performance evaporates. The deed was real property, held under her own name. In an era when a married woman holding real property under her own name was the single hardest thing to achieve, and the only thing that could not be taken back by a change of mood. In October of 1889, Robert Ray Hamilton sued to have the marriage declared void. It was the only move available to him, and it was not a simple one. To void the marriage, he had to establish in open court that his wife had been married to another man when she took his name, which meant putting the whole of it on a record that his family would have to live with permanently. The alternative was to remain the husband of a convicted woman in a state prison, and the legal father of a child he now knew he had not fathered. He chose the record. And it is worth noticing what he did not do. He did not disown the child publicly, and he did not attempt to have her removed from the estate by name. Whatever he thought of the woman, the girl had been his daughter for 7 months, and there is nothing in what he did afterward to suggest he blamed her for it. He left New York on the 30th of May, 1890, and went west, which is what men of his class did when they had been made ridiculous in front of the entire country. That summer, he bought a half-interest in a ranch belonging to a man named John Dudley Sargent near Jackson Lake, on the road into Yellowstone, and he intended to live there permanently. On the 23rd of August, 1890, he was found drowned in the Snake River. The press called the circumstances suspicious. When investigators from New York later disinterred the body, it had been forced into a wooden crate too small for it. His partner, John Dudley Sargent, was accused of murder. Sargent was found legally insane and was never prosecuted, and nothing was ever proved against him or anybody else. That is the whole of what can be said, and this film will not speculate further. Robert Ray Hamilton drowned 1 year to the week after the knife came out in Atlantic City, 2,000 miles from the boarding house on East 14th Street. And the last thing his second life cost him was the first one. His will left $10,000 for an ornamental fountain to be erected in New York City. Evangeline received a $10,000 settlement from the estate, $10,000 for a fountain, $10,000 for the wife. The estate valued them identically. She was released by the New Jersey Board of Pardons about 3 months after his death. Joshua Mann, her original husband, sued her for divorce in 1893. She appeared for a while on a stage in a theatrical production called The Hamertons, selling her own scandal by the ticket, which is the last time the record can see her clearly. After that, she goes. One account has her dying penniless at St. Vincent's Hospital on the 23rd of November, 1904, and buried in a common plot with a single mourner present. Other sources say her death was never established at all. This film will not choose between them, and there is something more chilling in the uncertainty than in either ending. The woman who spent 5 years constructing a person who did not exist walked out of the record entirely, and nobody was sufficiently interested to write down where she went. Chapter 15. The documents outlived all 4 of them. Everything these women built is gone, and the paper they signed it into is still filed. That is the strangest inheritance of this whole story, and it is worth walking through, because the surviving objects are not what a viewer would expect. There is no house. There is no jewel in a museum case. There is no portrait hanging in a corridor with a placard under it. What these 4 women left behind is documents, and the documents are all lies. Start with the ground. The Fair Oaks estate on the San Francisco Peninsula, where a young wife wrote a novel in secret because there was nothing else in the house for her to do, is now the incorporated town of Atherton, California. It carries the family name. It is one of the wealthiest addresses in the United States. People live today on the land where Dominga de Gogny Atherton decided that publication by a woman of the family was an obscenity, and the woman she said it about is the reason most people outside California have ever heard the name at all. Then the certificates. In New York, in March of 1937, 2 pieces of paper were generated for the same dead woman in the same week. One of them called her May de Pallant van Eerde. The other called her Marie, beloved wife of Edward Allen Morrissey. Neither document is wrong. Neither is complete. Between them, they contain a saloonkeeper's daughter from Menominee, a fugitive from a California larceny charge, a Dutch baroness, a professional extortionist, an adoptive mother, and a woman dying of cancer in New York. And no reader of either page would have suspected a single one of the others. Then the receipt. Sarah Howe died on the 26th of January, 1892, and at Forest Hills Cemetery in Jamaica Plain, there is a $5 fee paid by a stranger. $500,000 had gone through her hands. 1,200 women had entrusted her with what they had. 2 institutions had carried her design, and the only document that survives to prove she ended is a bill somebody else settled. And then the worst one. Somewhere in the vital records of the state of New York, there is a death certificate for an infant named Alice Mann, daughter of George and Alice Mann. Every name on it is false. The parents did not exist. The child had a mother somewhere in New York who had sold her, and a woman who could not feed her. And she was buried under 3 invented names by people who had bought her for $10 and needed her to be somebody else. And notice what is absent from that list. There is no house standing anywhere in America because one of these women built it. There is no collection in a museum, no foundation carrying a name, no window in a church, no wing of a hospital. The Gilded Age is remembered through its objects, through the mansions on Fifth Avenue, and the cottages at Newport, and the jewels that went to auction. And the reason those objects exist is that the men who commissioned them were permitted to sign contracts. These 4 women could not commission anything. Everything they made out of belief and paper, and belief evaporates and paper goes into a file. That is what these 4 women left. A town, 2 documents that contradict each other, a stranger's receipt, and a false record of a baby's death. There is one further object, and it is a book, and it closes a circle nobody involved could have intended. In 1902, Gertrude Atherton published a best-selling novel called The Conqueror. Its subject was Alexander Hamilton. There is no evidence that she had the Hamilton scandal in mind when she wrote it, and this film is not going to claim she did. 13 years had passed, and she was living another life on another coast. But the arrangement of it is hard to look away from. The first woman in this story, who had to sign herself as a demon in order to publish at all, ended by writing the life of the man whose name the last woman in this story bought for $10 and pinned on a stranger's child. One of them reached that name through a book that carried her own name on the cover. The other reached it through a boarding house on East 14th Street. Both of them wanted the same thing from it, which was to be taken seriously by a country that had already decided what a woman's word was worth. A name written in another hand. There is a pattern in how all 4 of them were finally caught, and it is not the one the period liked to tell itself. In the popular version, the wicked woman is undone by conscience, or by a loyal servant, or by an intimate who finally speaks. None of that happened here. Not one of these 4 was betrayed by somebody close to her. Gertrude Atherton was exposed because she told the family herself. May Dugas was exposed because a friend went to law and a court required her to answer. Sarah Howe was exposed because a newspaper printed an analysis of her interest rate. Eva Hamilton was exposed because a police blotter in New Jersey generated a court case and the New York papers followed it. In every case, the instrument was institutional: a courtroom, a newspaper, a register, a docket. The very machinery that had been too indifferent to check any of them in the first place turned out to be perfectly capable of taking them apart the moment it had a reason to look. That is the second half of the bargain these women made without knowing they were making it. An age that will not verify you also will not protect you. The same absence of scrutiny that let a woman invent a self was the absence that meant nothing stood between that self and the front page on the day somebody finally cared. Now the reckoning, which is the arithmetic underneath the whole film, and it runs in the opposite direction to the one a viewer expects. Gertrude Atherton counterfeited the least. One signature, on a magazine serial, concealing nothing worse than a woman's intention to work. She ended with a career of 50 years, the Legion of Honor, election to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a memoir published under her own name at 74, and a death at 90 in the city where she was born. May Dugar counterfeited a whole biography and a fortune of perhaps $2 million. She ended by settling a Michigan lawsuit for $13,515, having been required to say who she was out loud in the town she grew up in, and she died in a New York apartment, with her name spelled 2 different ways. Sarah Howe counterfeited an institution and 1,200 believers. She ended in a $5 grave paid for by somebody who did not know her. Eva Hamilton counterfeited a husband, a pregnancy, a family, and an heir to one of the founding names of the United States. She ended, if the report is right, in a common plot with one mourner, and if the report is wrong, she ended nowhere at all, which is worse. The more of a person these women manufactured, the less of one they were left holding. That is not a moral, and it is not justice, and this film is not going to present it as either. It is a mechanism, and it is the same mechanism in all 4 cases. A counterfeit that conceals a capability can be absorbed into a life, because when it is discovered, what is discovered is a woman who could do something. A counterfeit that conceals a theft cannot, because when it is discovered, what is discovered is that there was never anybody there. Gertrude Atherton's second self had written a novel. When the name came off, there was a novelist underneath it. And there is one more asymmetry, which is about time. A capability improves with use. Every year Atherton spent writing under a false name made her better at the thing the false name was hiding, so that by the time it came off, she had a decade of practice behind her. A deception does the opposite. Every year the others sustained theirs, the structure grew larger, the number of people who had to keep believing grew, and the eventual collapse got worse. One of them was building an asset the whole time. 3 of them were accumulating a liability. That is the difference between a woman who hides what she can do and a woman who hides what she has taken, and it is the only reliable rule this film has found. The others had constructed their second selves out of other people's belief, and belief is not a material. When it was withdrawn, there was nothing left standing. Chapter 16. Which one of them was the real woman? The question the age answered by law, and these 4 answered with their lives, is which of the 2 women was the real one? The law's answer was simple, and it never wavered. The real woman was the one on the marriage certificate. Mrs. followed by a man's name, holding an office at another person's pleasure, spending an allowance that could be revised in a house that was not hers, under a surname she could be stripped of. The other one, the one who read and wrote and calculated and decided and acted, was a fiction. That is not this film's interpretation. It is a description of what the statutes said, and it is worth asking what the age thought it was protecting by insisting on that answer, because the usual explanation that these were simply the customs of the time does not survive contact with the detail. Coverture was not an oversight. It was a system of asset protection. A fortune held by a family is only secure if it cannot be alienated by the person who marries into it, and the simplest way to guarantee that is to ensure that a wife cannot sign anything. The doctrine that a husband and wife are one person in law was not about romance, and it was not about frailty. It was about keeping capital inside bloodlines, And it worked extremely well for exactly as long as everybody involved was willing to pretend that a woman with no signature was a woman with no intentions. These 4 demonstrated the flaw in the design. If a person cannot act under her own name, she will act under another one. The system did not prevent the behavior it feared. It simply guaranteed that when the behavior came, it would arrive in disguise, and that nobody would see it until it was finished. But look at what each of them actually did with her hands. Gertrude Atherton, in a house where she was not permitted to earn, wrote a novel in secret and signed it with the name of a demon, and sat in a drawing room pouring tea while the city hunted for the author. May Dugar, at 18, moved into the most famous house in Chicago and enrolled in courses in psychology, French, and business law, and 30 years later explained to an attorney what a release absolves. Sarah Howe, who is reported to have had one of her own marriages annulled out of existence by a statute about race, built the only institution in Boston that would take an unmarried woman's money seriously and made silence the price of admission. Eva Hamilton stood in a boarding house on East 14th Street and handed back a living child because its eyes were the wrong color. Every one of those is a decision. Not one of them was made by a woman with no self. And if you had been handed a name, you could be removed from at any moment, an allowance instead of an income, a face the whole city watched, and a history nobody would check. It is not at all obvious which of the 2 women you would have decided was the real one either. And the Age's answer has not aged well, which is the part that ought to be said plainly. Coverture is gone. The Married Women's Property Acts finished their long work. A woman signs her own contracts, holds her own accounts, keeps her own earnings, and does not require anybody's countersignature to exist financially. What has not gone is the underlying question these 4 were answering, which is what a person does when the identity she is permitted is smaller than the one she has. That question did not belong to the 1880s. It belonged to a particular arrangement of law and property that happened to be in force then, and arrangements of law and property are still being made. The honest verdict, at the end of all 4, is that the second life was not an escape. It was a second cage, built by the prisoner to her own specification, and every one of them was still inside it at the end. May Dugas wore a title for 45 years and could not hold $1 in her own name. Sarah Howe built a bank and was buried on charity. Eva Hamilton acquired the name Hamilton and vanished out of the record entirely. Only Atherton got out, and she got out because of what she chose to counterfeit. Not a fortune, not a family, not a child, a right to work, which was the one thing the Age was withholding that she could supply herself. And it is worth saying what none of them got, because it is the same thing in all 4 cases. Not one of these women was ever able simply to be the person she actually was, in public, under her own name, and be paid and respected for it. Atherton reached it eventually, on another continent, after a widowhood. The other 3 never reached it at all. They were not asking for anything exotic. They wanted to work, to hold money, to be believed, and to sign their own names to what they had done. The Age charged an extraordinary price for those 4 things, and each of these women decided separately to pay it in counterfeit. There is one person in this story who never chose anything, and this film ends with her because she is the last unpaid debt in it. Beatrice Ray Hamilton was born to a woman whose name nobody recorded. She was sold for $10. She was kept alive by a woman called Grandmother, who was not her grandmother, presented to a man who was not her father, and given the surname of Alexander Hamilton, and written into an estate, and put at the center of the largest scandal in America in the autumn of 1889. And she was a few months old for all of it. She was the only genuinely innocent person in the entire construction, and she is the one the record does not follow. What can be said is that she was, for a period in 1889, one of the most discussed children in the United States, and that every newspaper discussing her was arguing about property, whether she was an heir, whether the marriage that made her one could be voided, whether the estate of a Hamilton could be reached by a girl whose parents nobody could name. Nobody was arguing about her, and she outlived them all. She outlived Robert Ray Hamilton, who drowned in a river in Wyoming 19 months after he first held her. She outlived the woman who bought her, in whichever way that ended. She outlived Joshua Mann and Anna Swinton and the entire arrangement that had produced her, and she carried, for the rest of whatever life she had, the surname of a man on the currency given to her by strangers in a boarding house who were trying to reach a trust fund. If she ever found out, no document records what she made of it. Go back to the boarding house, at the beginning, to the hands holding out an infant and the hands taking it back because the face was wrong. Everybody in that room wanted the same thing, which was a name that would be accepted. Gertrude Atherton wanted a name that would let her publish. May Dugas wanted a name that would open a door in Europe. Sarah Howe wanted a name that would make 1,200 women believe a fund existed. Eva Hamilton wanted a name for a child she had bought. They all got one. Not one of them got to keep it. Because a name in this age was never a possession. It was a document, and a document is only as good as the person who agrees to accept it. And every one of these 4 women learned the same lesson in the same order, that the signature holds exactly as long as nobody looks at the hand that wrote it. She asked her husband whether she could bring another man to live with them, and in her own words, given to a newspaper in the last autumn, any of it was still standing. This is what she said happened. I told him I wanted to take Josh Mann for company, and he said it was all right. If you have got this far, subscribe. It is the whole of the support this channel runs on. And tell me in the comments, if you had been handed a name you could be removed from at any moment, and no legal self of your own, which of these 4 would you have become?